Across Europe, the hard right is on the rise, while America has become deeply split between a party of progressive ideologues and a populist. Here in the UK, a Conservative government is presiding over high-tax, high-spending, low-growth economy that looks more like a creation of the centre-left than anything else. So we're here to ask if the centre-right can hold, or if increasing polarisation is inevitable. And in order to answer that, I think what we might also cover what we mean exactly when we talk about the centre-right, and if it deserves to survive at all. And to answer this, I'm delighted to be joined by my excellent panel. We have Lord Hannan, Vice Chairman of the Conservative Party, Dr. Frank Luntz, pollster and communications analyst, Dr. Stephen Davies, Head of Education at the IEA and Editor-in-Chief of CapX and Director of the Centre for Policy Studies, Robert Colvile. And how it's going to work is each of my speakers will speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll have a bit of discussion, and then we'll take questions from the audience. And can you all hear me okay? It sounds a bit, you can't hear at the back. Can you hear now? Any better? Can you hear?
For you all standing in the back, we've got 5 or 6 seats here.
Yeah, come forward, come forward.
Everyone.
Why don't you put your hand up if you have an empty seat next to you? Okay, guys at the back, come forward.
Thank you very much. Okay. That's great. Thanks so much, guys. So, Daniel, can we kick off with you?
Yeah, well, good morning, everyone. So there's still a couple of empty seats. Do please come in. Do come and sit down. I can see a friend of mine there, and I can see lots of empty seats here. Come and sit down, George. So, ladies and gentlemen, okay, what was for you the defining image of the year 2020? I'll tell you what mine was. It was the very first one. It was on New Year's Day, and it was that picture of the then Prime Minister, Boris, doing his thumbs up thing on Twitter and saying, yeah, this is going to be a fantastic year, right? Which prediction, to put this as gently as I can, did not work out. But I was very much of his opinion on the 1st of January 2020. We just won the election, and I thought we have this massive majority for a reforming Conservative government that is going to be able to shrink the state and get on top of the quangocracy and continue the reforms in welfare and education. I was full of optimism. And then, of course, this wrecking ball came in from the side. It was when Boris made that image, it was a speck no bigger than a man's hands over the skies of China, and it is the single political transformative event of our lifetimes, and I don't think we're going to outlive its effects. What I mean by that is not just that there was a massive expansion of the state, which we all know, but much more insidiously and much more dangerously, the lockdown changed the chemistry in people's brains. It's a well-observed psychological phenomenon. People respond to collective threats, or perceived collective threats, by becoming warier, more intolerant of any kind of dissent, more introverted, in a word, more authoritarian, more demanding of the smack of firm government. The last time we had anything on a comparable scale in the UK was the massive expansion of state powers in 1940 to deal with the war emergency. And obviously, you'll all be too young to remember this, apart from Lord Ashcroft, who I see over there, but the state was very slow to return after 1945 the powers that it had seized on a supposedly contingent basis during the mobilization, right? We had identity cards until 1953, we had food rationing until 1954, we had full conscription until 1960, not because people were prepared to put up with it, but because people were demanding it. Now, look at the current opinion polls. Look at the record support for nationalisation, for price fixing, for rent fixing and so on. We are in a statist moment the world over as a result of, if you like, long lockdown. Never mind long COVID, but long lockdown, the lasting impact of that diminution of freedom, of habituating people to the idea that they needed to ask the permission of the authorities to use their own property to travel or whatever it is. And here's the worst thing. I think that was reinforcing a trend already underway. Most of us grew up in a world where we expected liberal democracy to spread. I mean, if we're defining can the centre-right win, I would define the centre-right, the liberal conservatives, as people who are conservative in the sense of defending an essentially liberal tradition which elevates the individual above the collective, right? That for me is the Western tradition, one that where the rules are above the rulers and where there is maximum freedom for the private citizen. That way of looking at the world grew solidly for 7 decades after World War II. Actually, sometimes grew very quickly. There was a rush of countries liberated from fascism after 1945, another rush liberated from communism after 1990, and everyone thought it was going to go on forever, or a lot of people thought it was going to go on forever. But something odd has happened, which I'm not sure we have ever adequately explained. Between 2010 and 2015, the number of countries becoming law-based democracies began to stutter to a halt and then to go into reverse. And every year, for at least 8 or 9 years now, maybe more, depending on how you measure it, there's been a growth in the number of authoritarian regimes around the world. There are various organizations that measure this. There's a thing called IDEAS. The UN does its own measure. The Economist Intelligence Unit does one. There's a thing called the Democracy Index. They all use slightly different methodologies, but they all tell the same story, which is that personal freedom, the rule of law, and an individual society are in retreat globally. So it just, I mean, I don't want to depress everyone finishing my opening statement as the first speaker, but entertain conjecture of the possibility that actually we've been living through an interglacial and the ice age stretches ahead. We are a tribal species. We evolved in kin groups. Collectivism and hierarchy come very naturally to us. You see it in our literature, you see it in our folk story, and actually never mind our fairy tale. Look at our science fiction. Think of, Star Wars or Dune or something. It's all full of emperors and princesses and powerful armies. On some deep level, right, we're evolved primates and we think that this is the natural way to govern things. Is it not horribly plausible that the liberal interlude through which we've been living these last 200 or 300 years was always quite artificial, was heavily dependent on education, on inculcating these values that don't come naturally to people, and that when you stop doing that, we revert to the kind of authoritarian societies, the kinds of places where people elevate outcome over process, the kind of places where they don't care about the rules as long as the leader of their tribe is winning, which would have been recognized by every other human regime from the Iron Age slave empires up until an eye blink ago in the early modern period. The role of organizations like this is to do something about it. But let's be honest, since the lockdown and since the effect that that's had, we're starting from behind.
Thank you, Daniel. And Frank, I'm sure you're going to...
Okay, first, there are 7 seats up here. For those of you standing in the back who are having trouble hearing, because I keep seeing people leaning forward, we got a bunch of seats in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th row, and we've got 4 seats that are up here. So there's no reason for you to be in the back. A whole bunch there, and a whole bunch right here. Second is you don't want to depress them. I want to scare the shit out of you. I know that I have a reputation of being very open and honest in programs like this. Here's the problem. I'm sitting next to one of the vice chairmen of the Conservative parties who has, your people have been so kind to me, and you've invited my students to come here on Tuesday. So I have to be really nice until they actually get into the hall, and then I can be more candid. I do mean to frighten you. I've been around the country. I finally, after all this time, I decided I need to go out and do a road trip. I was in the South, I was in the North, I've been to Scotland, I've been to Wales, I've sat down not just with MPs, not just with business leaders, but with average voters. And the kindness that they show me is really incredible. And I say this because America has lost this. You all, when I was here at Oxford in the 1980s, you were cruel. You were mean.
To you? Or
to me. That's how I got a chance to get to know Boris, who, by the way, never changed. He looks the same, he sounds the same, he acts the same. If you ever want photographs of that time, if you work for the news media, let me know and I can sell them to you. Having traveled this country, having traveled the globe, talking to citizens about what democracy means to them, we're losing it. We don't appreciate it. We don't respect it. Who here is under age 25? Raise your hands. If your hand is up right now, you have a 50-50 shot of living when you in a non-democratic government. I think it is that bad. And I'm watching what's happening in America with Donald Trump, with our ugliness. And so I don't want to complain about it. I want to solve it. And I'm going to, for those of you who are interested, if you work for an MP, if you work for a council person, I want to, sorry about this, I want to talk to you about town halls and about better connecting to people. Number one, you need to invite those who have never had a voice to have a conversation. We don't do enough for reaching out. We invite people to come, and who shows up but people in this room? You're not average. You're weird. What day of the week is this?
Sunday.
This is Sunday. What the hell are you doing? And for anyone who's wearing a suit and tie on a Sunday afternoon, you are really weird. So you invite people who've never had a chance to talk to their elected representatives before. Number two, give them a piece of literature. The one thing that you should have done here, because this room is packed, is give oh, you got it. You got stuff on the chairs. Give people something to read. Give them something to discuss. Number three, let your audience speak first. Every time I see the politicians, they want to do their introductions. They want to tell people what they're doing. Before you speak, let your audience, let the voters go first. Turn the tables. They're not expecting it, but they want their voice heard. So I know you've got a distinguished journalist here who does not necessarily like the stuff that's talked about here. But what we can agree on is that the public feels ignored, forgotten, and betrayed. And by the way, I'm going to need your NHS very soon.
Good luck.
So I need to switch my my passport really quickly. Although they will see me, won't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, well.
Okay, so anyone has the phone number of the local hospital, I may need it before this is done. Number four, they want to be taught, but they don't want to be lectured to. Which means that you should have the ability to show them the information that they may not know because they don't get access to it. They don't know where to go for it. I don't see that this is part of your town hall process. Number five is that you yourself, as the MP or the elected official, should be moving chairs, should be helping people, should be engaging people before and after the session so that you're a human being and not just an elected official. And I feel like I have to shout, which is the problem. And number six, give them more than what they ask for. If they want an hour, stay for an hour and a half. If they have 8 questions, give them 12. And ask them questions. It should not just, it should not be just, I know I sound horrible. It should not be just the MP or the elected official asking the audience or answering questions from the audience. They should be asking the audience to learn and to understand. For example, how many of you in this room, I'm going to ask you a very embarrassing question, but you should know. How many of you in this room believe the Conservatives are going to win next year, are going to still run the government after the election? Raise your hands. 4, 5, 6 people. How many of you believe that Labor will be in charge after the next election? Raise your hands. So that tells me something. It tells me that there has to be a lot of hard work. It tells me that there has to be energy and excitement. But I need to know that to be able to achieve that. So I'm going to give it back to you. But I promise you, if I don't die by tomorrow, the presentations I'm going to give are hopefully going to be about fixing democracy and fixing the right of center rather than complaining about it.
Thanks very much, Frank. I hate to tell you, I think doctors are on strike at the moment, so...
Doctors aren't... Okay, if the doctors are on strike, I'm fucked. So.
I think it just... I think it goes to show the amount of dissatisfaction that there is with the current system. Anyway, thank you, Dr. Davies.
Okay. Well, You just heard two very downbeat assessments. My assessment is not quite as downbeat, but it's more diagnostic, if you will. So I shared Daniel Hannan's sort of understanding of what the term centre-right is commonly understood to mean. And that is broadly my view as well. But in a way, I would query the question that this event is centred around. Does the centre-right have a future? Because that implies that there's a recognisable entity called the centre-right that persists through time. And the question is it going to go on? And what I would argue, putting my historian's hat on, is that the terms left, right and centre change their commonly understood meaning over time. And what is going on at the moment, which partly explains the kind of phenomenon that both Frank Luntz and Dan Hannan have spoken about, is that the nature of political divisions is changing. So until a few years ago, for about 40 or 50 years, maybe even longer, the dominant dividing line was over broadly economics. Did you favour an expansive role for the state or did you not? Did you rather favour voluntary action and free markets? The right was the side that broadly favoured free markets and voluntary action. And that right was divided between people who combined that with social traditionalism and conservatism and people like myself and Lord Hannan here who combined it with a broadly liberal outlook on social issues. Now, what is happening at the moment, and has happened completely in quite a few countries like France, India, the United States, is that that is no longer the way you tell the difference between left and right. The dividing line now is a set of cultural and identity issues. The economics still matters, but it's secondary. And increasingly now, right is defined by being anti-globalist, sceptical about free trade, strongly opposed to supranationalism, very hostile to migration, but also culturally traditionalist and very often authoritarian, but also increasingly in favour of an active role for government in the economy. Neo-mercantilist, if you will, not socialist, but in favour of what you might call, using the good old French word, a dirigiste approach to the economy. Things like a national industrial strategy and things of that sort. And that's a coherent worldview, if you like. It's not one, however, that I share. So given that that's a worldview and a way of a kind of politics that is on the rise and is now coming to be seen as what defines being on the right, the question is what becomes of the centre-right as defined by Dan Hannan a moment ago? Something which looks to defend and maintain the Western liberal tradition of a free society, the rule of law, and a limited role for government. Not no role for government, but a limited role for government. It becomes much more difficult. I think that that kind of politics is going to survive because there are enough people out there, both here in this room, in this event and conference, and out there in wider society, who support and favour it. But it's not clear to me what the vehicle for that is going to be, or how it's going to be done. Now, one of the things I would say, I was very sort of taken with Frank Luntz's remarks there. What would I say you need to do? Now, I don't quite put the emphasis on the pandemic that Lord Hannan did. I think that what the pandemic did, as he actually said towards the end of his remarks to that effect, is to dramatically accelerate and crystallise changes that were already in train, things that were already going on, which is what major disasters like pandemics and wars actually do. They don't tend to bring changes themselves. They tend to make people who are already leaning in a certain direction or moving in a certain direction suddenly shift much more sharply and rapidly than they might otherwise have done. Given that the world is moving the way he described, and given also that it's becoming much more unstable and much more dangerous due to the progressive breakdown of the relatively stable, ruled, governed international order that the United States and its allies put together from 1948 onwards, with the basic breakdown of the WTO's disputes resolution mechanism, for example, the growing trade war between the US and China, growing geopolitical tensions between the US and China, and of course a war in Europe, something which I don't think many of us foresaw a few years ago. Given that, how do you express the case for the tradition that I share with Daniel Hannan here in a way that will actually make that case, whatever vehicle you're using for it, more popular and acceptable. And I would agree with everything that Frank Luntz said, but I would like put two other spins on it. One is avoid managerialism. What you do not want to do is to come across as being the person who is a spokesman or woman for a kind of technocratic managerial elite who know what is best for hoi polloi, the common people, enlightened and benevolent purpose, no doubt, but who are still going to come like the doctor to tell you what to do. Do not do that. That is poison, because a large part of what is driving this kind of new politics that I described is a reaction against the condescension that ordinary people feel is visited upon them by the what you might call the educated elite. It's no coincidence that the biggest single predictor of a division these days in politics is whether or not you have a degree. That's the big dividing line. And that is not simply because of what people learn at university, it's more because it is a kind of proxy for a whole other range of divisions. What kind of work you do, where you live, what kind of life you live, and also whether or not you see yourself as expressing what you might call the common views of ordinary people, or more enlightened and educated views. So avoid at any cost technocratic managerialism in either your rhetoric or your policy. The other thing, which I would say, is that all political parties, not just the Conservative Party, but all of them, need to rediscover and recreate means of communicating with ordinary people. Because over the course of my lifetime, what has happened is that the enormously extensive civil society grassroots of our major political parties have withered away. When I was a young person back in the 1960s, the Conservative Party and the Labour Party were both major civil society institutions with millions of members, directly or indirectly, a whole network of social clubs and organisations. In places like South Wales, where I grew up at that time, the Miners' Institutes and the Miners' Union, the Labour Party, were like the centre of society, along with the chapel, as they called it. That is all gone. Politicians now communicate almost entirely through electronic media. And I think that that is proving to be incredibly destructive for the whole political process. And one of the things I would strongly urge, not just the tradition that I want to see going forward and growing in strength, the tradition that Daniel Hannan described, but in fact politics in general, one of the things that needs to happen is for politicians to recreate that kind of method through civil society of connecting with ordinary voters in the way that Frank Luntz described.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Is this working? Yes, you can hear me. Rob?
Well, I feel slightly like I'm on a panel called Can Democracy Survive, which is slightly even more depressing than the original thing. So the first thing to say is that this is happening in lots and lots of other countries. The centre-right party, the traditional centre-right party in Canada was vaporised and has since sort of rebuilt itself. The traditional centre-right party in France was vaporised. The traditional centre-right party in America has been transmogrified beyond recognition. Its last policy platform, which essentially, it literally said, we haven't got time to do a proper manifesto because of the pandemic, so we just believe everything that Donald Trump says, which is quite extraordinary. So as Dan says, until 2019 it looked as though the UK was the exception to that. That Brexit had, Fraser Nelson's made this point, that Brexit had sort of acted as a safety valve and had sort of rebuilt a level of consensus and sort of seen the anti-politics elements slightly drained away. But I think there are, in terms of whether the centre-right can survive, I think we're in a sort of dangerous situation. So John Curtis, and I promised John I was going to say this even before I noticed you in the audience, has said very, very rightly that the model of British politics is essentially, public opinion in the UK is essentially homeostatic. What happens is you get a Labour government, you get people worried that the government hasn't spent enough money and that the schools and hospitals are falling apart. So you get a Labour government in, and then the Labour government spends lots of money, and the schools and hospitals, lots of money goes into the schools and hospitals, and then after a bit everyone goes, well, this is all very very well, but my taxes are really high because I'm having to pay for all these schools and hospitals, and wouldn't it be nice to have lower taxes? And then the Conservatives get back in, and then after the Conservatives have been there for a while, everyone goes, oh, these low taxes are very nice, but you know, the schools and hospitals are looking a bit threadbare, and kind of rinse and repeat. You know, this cycle, you basically see this pattern playing out for sort of 40 or 50 years. But there are three things that are happening now which sort of are bad for that cycle, and in particular bad for the centre-right bit of that cycle. One is it's not the pandemic, as Dan identified, but not so much the pandemic as inflation as well. So Frank did some work for us at the CPS, looking at what people understand to be the meaning of freedom to be. So in America, especially on the Republican side, freedom is just absolutely everything. If you are Ron DeSantis, if you are someone who wants to be a Republican leader, you will use the word freedom in every single speech. You will call all your speeches freedom. You will have freedom in the title of your books. Here, freedom is a sort of personal thing. It's about having the freedom to live the kind of life you want to live. It's not about this. It's not an abstract ideal. And actually, quite a lot of people, and an increasing number of people, including many Conservatives, see the government and government spending as a deliverer of that freedom. That you know, partly because the Conservatives are in power, Conservative voters, not so much maybe the people who come to Conservative conference, are actually pretty okay with lots of money being spent, which is also partly because Conservative voters tend to be elderly, and elderly people tend to be okay with lots of money being spent, especially on the NHS and their care. And that, in fact, is the second, and so just, in fact, but some more recent polling in similar vein by Public, I think it was Public First, showed that inflation, as a result of the inflationary pressures, suddenly people are saying that if you ask them what is the responsibility of government, what is its basic duty, suddenly they are seeing a much more expansive role for government. They'll say, you know, is the role of government to fix prices? You got very, very small answers for that about a year ago, and very, very large answers to that now. Is it to direct companies to what to do? You get much larger. Is it kind of to intervene in the economy? Is it to essentially both the pandemic, but then also crucially the cost of living crisis has suddenly got everyone going, oh, someone needs to fix this, and government is the thing that will fix it. That's obviously bad for the centre-right. The second big factor that I think is bad for the centre-right is an ageing population. So again, this isn't news to anyone in this room, but you know, Britain's population is getting much, much older. Over the next 50 years or so, to preserve the welfare state we have at the moment, to preserve all the entitlements we have at the moment, and you probably need spending on the elderly to rise by about 11% of GDP. That's basically doubling income tax, or trebling corporation tax, or whacking VAT up to like 30%. I mean, these are like really, really, really big figures. So the arguments that we keep on having about whether we can cut taxes again, the dynamic on that, the ratchet effect on that is just relentlessly against the Conservative Party, which is why you have all these cabinet ministers who say, I'm a low-tax Conservative, but they can't actually manage to cut taxes. It's not just about the cost of the pandemic, although the cost of the pandemic and the borrowing for it is huge. It's about the ongoing cost of an ageing population. And unless you can actually make an argument to people that there are things government should not be doing, there are things government should be doing differently, there are large chunks of spending we are spending at the moment which we are going to have to stop spending, or maybe that people will have to contribute towards their own social care when they, you know, maybe use some of that housing wealth they've accrued. Unless you can make those kind of arguments, unless politicians have the courage to make those kind of arguments, then the ratchet effect will be only one way, towards a state which doesn't look even like a kind of modern social democratic state, which like the highest tax states in Europe at the moment are where we are heading towards, sort of at a bare minimum. And then the other final thing, of course, is the media environment and social media. And also, I wrote a book called The Great Acceleration, which is about how technology is accelerating the pace of life, and that's been very good in an awful lot of ways. But what also happened is that we were all essentially retreating into our own bubbles and hearing what we want to hear. I mean, in the UK, that's been slightly slower than in the US for cultural reasons, I think. Maybe the presence of the BBC in our kind of as a kind of policer of polite discourse is doing that. But you are getting this kind of, you know, the idea of the kind of the centre right. The centre right sort of exists by definition is kind of in relation to the centre and to the right. It's kind of when you say centre right, you're sort of talking about the bit of the right that can kind of go to dinner parties in London and not be kind of viewed as beneath the souls, or it's a sort of a sort of establishment-ish stuff. Like we call the CPS a centre-right think tank because it's a kind of code for saying we are sort of grown up and moderate, and we try to suggest sensible things that politicians can actually do while moving in the country in the direction that we want it to move in. And I think, obviously, you saw in innumerable ways. You're seeing how people are, just not really having the same conversations as each other. That kind of idea of a shared national dialogue and framework and narrative is breaking down. Look at the reaction to the Russell Brand affair. I'm not going to make any comments on the allegations themselves, but it was really striking. The number of people who just came out and said, he is an enemy of the mainstream and the establishment, and therefore he is right, and I will support him, before they'd even heard what he was being accused of. And I think that's a profoundly dangerous thing. So I don't have many optimistic thoughts to think otherwise, apart from just the kind of the classic line that if something can't go on sooner or later, it won't go on, right? Like we can, the public, I don't think, will put up with doubling income tax over the next 50 years. I think they will probably say, oh, maybe we can actually do things differently and better. And obviously, the CPS will have lots of wonderful ideas for doing that.
I mean, that's quite a gloomy prospectus you've all laid out. I'll just try and introduce a note of positivity. And I want to pick up on what you said, Daniel, about this analogy of COVID and the war. It's something that Nigel Lawson talked about in a speech he made to the Centre for Policy Studies, which is republished on CapX. I recommend you all read it, where he says that the Second World War demonstrated the power of collectivity and changed the dynamic. And change the country into a more left-wing environment with a welfare state and so on. But then, of course, we did have the Thatcher Revolution. So I wonder if we might be in a similar cyclical position, and perhaps the pandemic has changed the country, but eventually, as Rob was saying, as taxes continue to rise and spending gets out of control, perhaps one day, inevitably, we will see a return of the centre-right.
I mean, I'm not sure that the pendulum ever quite moves back to where it was, or the dial doesn't quite move back. A lot of what we think of...
That's what I was trying to say, everything is, the ground is shifting so much that even when we go right, it will be...
Right, so taking Alys's parallel of the war and Thatcherism, the Thatcher Revolution subsisted in large parts of undoing controls that had been put in 1940 on a supposedly contingent basis, exchange controls and so on. Right? They then lasted for 2 generations because, first of all, people are change averse, what Milton Friedman called the tyranny of the status quo. But secondly, it is very difficult to undo collectivism because people are attuned to it. And I have to say that I very much agreed with Steve Davies. He's written very eloquently about this realignment many times. The thing that most annoys me about the Bannonite, Trumpy kind of big government, socialist, conservative statism is their pretense that they've come up with something new. That this is some radical reaction to hitherto unencountered situations like the rise of China or globalization involving very low-paid workers. In fact, what they're doing is they are recycling the oldest and worst ideas in economics.
Yes.
Ideas that were pretty comprehensively debunked by Adam Smith the year before the American Republic was born, right? But people keep coming back to them. As the dog returneth to his vomit, so the fool returneth to his folly. People keep coming back to them because we have the instincts and intuitions of hunter-gatherers, which served us very well on the savannas of Pleistocene Africa, but are badly designed for a world of skyscrapers and superabundance. So I would just say to the people who think it's radical and chic and populist and against the elites to be in favour of this kind of protectionist, mercantilist, sort of communitarian conservatism. The one place where the elites have been running that for 80 years is Argentina. The one place where you have a genuinely populist reaction against that is in the candidacy of Javier Milei, who's currently ahead in the polls. And what you see in Argentina is that a wealthy country with an educated and intelligent electorate can be pauperized by exactly this kind of program of keeping out imports and banning exports and large state control and high taxes. And yet, for 80 years people carried on voting for it because on some very deep psychological level, free markets are counterintuitive. And so I come back to saying our only shot is education. The thing about counterintuitive ideas are those are the ones that you can show people to be wrong by using logic and reason. Yeah? And that's why, that was traditionally the role of our schools and particularly our universities. They were temples of the Enlightenment. They were there to diffuse these rather difficult counter-cyclical liberal ideas, such as the idea that people that you don't like might still be right about something. That, as any of you who's been on social media knows, is not an idea that comes naturally to human beings. It's much more natural to start with whether you like someone and then cast around for whether we agree with them. All of those things used to be done by our educators. My worry now, so I'm sure you've all worked out where I'm going with this, is not only that we're not doing that in schools, it's that we're actually slightly doing the opposite. We're teaching a new kind of collectivism in the form of identity politics. Instead of teaching people the difficult and counterintuitive idea that we're all individuals, we're all responsible for our own behavior, we're all accountable for our own actions, we are increasingly teaching that the most interesting and important thing about you is that you're white or female or whatever it is. And that is a very, very difficult doctrine to reconcile with an open society.
Can I add to that?
Of course.
1 out of 10, what you just said is brilliant. Because the reason why I joined conservatism was the smart people came here. In my country, George Will, William F. Buckley, James Q. Wilson. In your country, Margaret Thatcher. The people who I respected the most, they were civil and they were smart. And now I go to these conservative rallies and they are rude and they boo. If you watch the first or second Republican debates, you could hear it. It was horrible.
And look how quickly that happened.
And it's now acceptable.
Look how quickly that happened. I was at the Republican convention in Cleveland when Trump was nominated, and he made one of his usual speeches about tariffs and how imports they're laughing at us on trade and they're hollowing out this kind of all utter demonstrable bullshit. I mean, in fact, and on one level he must have known that, right? Because if you remember in his term of office, he kept on saying NAFTA's a disaster, trade is a disaster, and then every other tweet was record employment, record investment, record growth. They could not both be true, and it was the second that was accurate. And yet, people who all my life had been sort of broadly Reaganite at those Republican conventions, broadly in favor of limited government, were all whooping and ululating like Bedouin tribes at this stream of consciousness that we were getting from the nominee, and you realize how fragile all this is. That an unscrupulous politician, or indeed just a politician who doesn't have any sense of constraint, can cut through all the conventions and learnings and accumulated knowledge and appeal to the inner caveman, and they will respond.
But I've heard it here not at this event, but I heard it in the UK for the first time. 2 of the town halls I went to, the people were absolutely atrocious in yelling at their MPs. And I thought this was only in America. I'm generally looking for a place to go where I can get maybe I'm trying to find a place that doesn't exist. But the level of hate and rejection that I thought was horrible 2 years ago is now, I would say, don't let it come to this country. Well, I've now seen it. Where people will write others off because they are ignored or forgotten or they feel betrayed. But you're looking at people who are 75 or 80 years old, people that used to talk about British traditions and culture with pride are using language that a really uneducated American would use. I never thought I'd hear that in this country, and I'm hearing it for the first time. And I'm saying to you all, you can't let it happen. If you allow your side, our side, to speak with such bile, then don't be upset if the other side does exactly the same thing. Conservatives would disagree and they went back to work. They were not the protesters because they had jobs. Well, now there is no limit, thank you, Donald Trump, there's no limit to what people will say. And I'd say to you, part of the center right, part of the reason why I've loved being associated with you all, I'm not qualified, I'm not smart enough, I'm listening to you speak. Oh my God, would you please come to America and straighten us out? And all you have to do is just read from the phone book and we'll follow you wherever. We have become cruel and inhuman. And I pray, and I'm glad that there's so many people here, Don't let that happen to your country. There are some things that are more important than an election, and that's your civilization. Please.
Could I say something to that? Could I inject a note of optimism in the proceedings here?
No!
But no, I agree completely with that, but I think that it is dangerous to underestimate the resources of civil society and of civility in this country. Because I think that at the moment what we have is a situation where the kind of behaviour Frank describes is being magnified and disseminated by the way social media works. But I think that we're seeing a reaction against it, and what that suggests that what we need is a kind of, if you like, a sort of cultural politics, one that emphasises civility, as well as actual ideas, ways of living, ways of communicating. And also, to respond to what Robert said, the really good news is that, in a way, the ratchet is stuck in both directions, in my view. We are in this situation where I'm not sure people do want the government to do more. They don't like the situation that things are in, but at the same time, the widespread perception is that the government, by which I mean not just the administration, but the state, is totally bloody useless. It can't do anything. We have the worst possible kind of situation. We have a government which is extremely large, spending a very large proportion of GDP, record take of taxation in peacetime, but at the same time, it can't do anything. And of course we have all these rumours at the moment that having spaffed over 40 billion on a high-speed rail link, they're now going to cut it so that you can have a really fast way of getting from Birmingham to Acton. Wow. No, what an amazing contribution to the national infrastructure. So what I think is widespread at the moment is a lot of people essentially holding their head in their hands, because what they can see is, on the one hand, you have a state which is not delivering functions that they think it should be doing, but on the other hand, they also can't afford to pay any more tax, and they don't trust the government with any more money because they quite rightly think that it's completely useless and incompetent. And that is a terrible situation, but it's also an amazing opportunity. If you do serious thinking about how to address this problem, you can actually come up with radical solutions, and I think many voters are in such a state of despair that they'll take them seriously. They'll be prepared to listen to them. And I think actually we missed a huge chance in 2010, because what we had was austerity, which meant basically the government doing all the things it had previously done but spending less money on them, which is not the way to go. The way to go is to actually have a really serious grown-up national conversation about what we want government to do. And I think when you realise that the British state has never, ever in its entire history got more than 38% of national income in tax revenue in peacetime, that means that there's a kind of hard limit on how much you can spend. And what you need is some serious thinking about what the role of government should be. Now that's the kind of conversation that at the moment you can't have, partly because of what Frank Luntz is saying. But I think that therefore there's a kind of dual project of, on the one hand, developing ideas, the kind of work that CPS does, and on the other hand, having a kind of more general campaign that we should all take part in to restore civility to public discourse.
Rob, did you have anything to say on that?
No, I'm just...
Okay, we're going to take questions from the audience now. Dylan, have you got the microphone? There's a lady here.
Hi, I've been really fascinated by what you're saying. I'm actually part of a One Nation grassroots WhatsApp group, which has actually kept me in the party, because we've been clinging on by our fingertips. We don't feel like we're represented. Yeah, for me, it's all about the economy. And all of this alt-right culture wars and driving centre-right away. My children are natural economic conservatives. They won't touch us with the basketball. We need exactly what you're talking about, these town halls. We need to get the youngsters back involved. We need to get the number of people voting a dropping. How can we engage the population? When you engage the bulk of people, not the extremes, but the bulk, we will get back. And I swear that the centre ground is where we all should be, and that's the only way to have a good functioning democracy.
The problem is the average age of a Labour voter is about 38, maybe 40. The average age of a Conservative voter is deceased. She's alive. And I wish that, And I'm so grateful to CCHQ for letting me bring my students here. It's a mission of mine. And so I'm going to have 9 students that are going to meet a bunch of the MPs. I hope it has an impact on them. If it doesn't, it's okay. But I want them to get closer to their government. I want to make sure that every MP goes to their local schools, that goes to their local universities, has this conversation. But I know a lot of them now, maybe 80 of them. And I know people from Labor as well. The Labor MPs are going to have these conversations with young people. I don't see the Conservatives doing it.
So this is what I wrote my Sunday Times column on today, is that age is one of the things behind all of the stuff we're talking about, is that age is the big polarizing line in our politics. At the last election, young people, 18 to 24s, went 60-20 to Labour. Over 65s went 60-20 to the Tories. That's an absolutely huge swing. You don't see that on any other kind of way in which you break down the electorate. And that's obviously quite good for the Conservatives structurally, because there are more old people, or because of turnout factors, there are more old voters than there are young voters. But it also contributes towards the polarisation that we're talking about, and it's one of the challenges to centre-right, because this, as Steve said, this is a polarisation about education as well. Like the stereotypical Conservative voter now is both elderly but also culturally conservative. Culture has come into it a lot more. The stereotypical younger voter is both Labour and more socially liberal, more and degree educated. He's been through one of these left-wing madrasas that I was talking about. So the problem is there is a gulf of incomprehension between those. There's a gulf of antagonism, and it also means that, I mean, long term, it is a problem for the Conservatives, because along with the housing crisis, which I talk about endlessly, the sort of transmission mechanism from left to right, it is sort of breaking down. There's evidence people aren't moving from left to right as quickly as they used to, and even if they were, they are starting from such a monolithically left-wing position that it's going to take them an awfully long time to get over to the Tory side. But also the things that, people do care about the cultural stuff, absolutely for sure, but they also care. They really care about being able to own houses, and being able, and having affordable childcare, and having, good transport links, and not having potholes, and not having crime, and all of the absolute root and branch 5 pledges stuff that the government should be focusing on.
Civility needs to be modelled, and free speech needs to be both taught and modelled. Okay, one of the problems we have is that not only are you can leave school at 18, you can even get a politics degree without really encountering John Locke or John Milton or J.S. Mill. But a bigger part of it is modelling it, and I do want to say one thing positive and optimistic. Steve and I are both involved with an organisation called the John Locke Institute that basically runs gap years and summer schools for kids in the sort of lower sixth form. And one of the things that they do is they try and inoculate you against cancel culture before you go to university by modelling it. So they have, for example, they'll do an exercise where, are you familiar with what's known as the ideological Turing test? So the Turing test is a computer lifelike enough that you think it's human. The ideological Turing test, invented by Brian Kaplan, is, can you argue a position with which you disagree so convincingly that nobody guesses that you don't really hold it? And this summer school would, they'd get some hot button issues. Should we take down statues of slavers? Should private schools be abolished? And they would pair people who agreed and didn't agree with the line they were meant to be taking, and then the audience would have to guess, whether they actually believed in it. And the point was, it was teaching them to listen to each other. They, I put it to you, arrive at university now properly inoculated against the idea that people who disagree with you are engaging in some kind of physical assault. Right? Now, every school should be doing that, shouldn't it? Shouldn't that just be an automatic part of teaching people to function as a citizen in a society where there is a plurality of opinion? One more point while I'm on this optimistic roll. Frank said, is there any country, is there an imaginary country where politics is still polite and civil? Yeah, actually you don't have to go very far. You find it north of the 49th parallel. I was just at the Conservative Party convention in Quebec City, the Canadian Conservative Party convention. Canadian politics is still, Canadians don't believe this when you tell them, but by anyone else's standards, it's still unbelievably courteous. To go to a hustings meeting there is to enter this bizarre world where the candidates are all saying, oh, I'm terribly sorry, I thought you'd finished, please carry on. No, was that, did I misunderstand you? And there is, what is happening in the US of basically refusing to accept election results unless your side wins, of automatically going to the courts if you don't like the outcome, is unthinkable there. Now, how have they managed it? There's a whole bunch of reasons we could have a whole conversation, but one point I really want to make, just following on from what Rob Colvile just said. The leader of the Canadian Conservative Party, incredibly impressive politician called Pierre Poilievre. He's my favourite centre-right leader in the world. I suppose I should say second favourite while I'm here, but the most eloquent and impressive guy. Now, if pushed for an opinion, he doesn't shy away from culture wars. You know, if he has to, he will opine that women have wombs or whatever, which is apparently a controversial thing to say in Canada. But he'd much rather be talking about the need for tax cuts. And the way he has got his party ahead is by reversing that demographic that Rob was just talking about. The Conservatives in Canada are ahead with voters under the age of 35. Because Pierre's shtick, from the moment he stood for the leadership, was to say, you young people are the most betrayed generation in modern history. You were locked up because of a virus that posed no threat to you. You've now been allowed out and presented with a bill for the whole damn thing. You can't get onto the housing ladder because the central bank is acting as an ATM machine for spendthrift governments. And various producer-driven regulations are keeping you out of the job market. Vote Conservative and I will bust all that open. Now, I think that is believed because it is credible. You can see how he would do it. But it shows that it is, even, this is in a very woke country, especially among young people. It's a country that is strongly into identity politics, but you can still win as a tax-cutting Conservative if you get the tone right. And he has, I mean, I didn't think this was possible. He's turned monetary policy into a populist cause. It can happen.
First of all, thank you all for this speech. I totally agree with the lady that spoke about the need to refocus our conversation on economic issues, and that is the bread and butter of the conversation. I would just like to ask Daniel Hannan, because I don't know if this may sound as hypocrisy or something like that, but does he regret when David Cameron moved the Conservatives away when the Conservative Party was still in the European Parliament, of course, from the European People's Party, and they formed the European Conservatives and Reformists with, for instance, the PIS, the party which is in power in Poland right now, and which is having an election against a centre-right party, against Tusk's civic platform, which is focusing on those issues, on those economic core issues, while the PIS is playing things with using rhetoric regarding women, homosexuals, and playing cultural wars to hide the fact that Poland has not grown enough and is clearly lagging behind other countries like Estonia, other countries that have centre-right policy in power. And to Dr. Stephen Davies' point about refocusing our debate in the role of the state, would every Conservative Party rethink the role of the NHS and the role of government in the NHS and rethink the system in a more kind of, in the way that exists in Germany, for instance, in which private companies are allowed, and it has existed for quite a while.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Sorry.
Giving it short time, is it?
No, I don't regret it. Look, it's natural in every country for people to think things are going more badly than they really are. We're certainly guilty of that historically here. But Poland is due to overtake the UK in terms of GDP per head by the end of the next decade. It's really not surprising that people might want to re-elect the incumbent.
Complaining that Poland hasn't grown enough in the UK is like
Yes. Other things you can complain about, but with quite correctly, but not that.
And on the NHS?
Well, then I think we're actually in an unusual position here. I think we're actually at that point where having a serious conversation about the National Health Service has become possible. It's one of those areas where I think there is a kind of growing public perception that things simply cannot go on as they are. And I think a few years ago, if people like myself or my then colleague Kate Andrews would make comments about how Europeans actually did it much, much better, and that was something we ought to be looking at, the Swiss or the Dutch or the French health systems, to learn from those examples, you were simply laughed out of court. Now I think you're actually going to get much more of a reception, because it's become pretty obvious to everyone that the amount of money that the health service is going to require is simply going to be insupportable unless something pretty drastic is done to reform the way healthcare and also social care in this country works. And so I think there is actually an opening there. The big problem, quite frankly, is the journalist class, because of journalists who are A, numerous, and B, totally obsessed with the United States. Which means that they seem to think that the only alternative to the British healthcare system is the one that exists in the United States. They never seem to notice that there's a whole bunch of countries 22 miles away across the English Channel who have a completely different and much better system, which is not at all like the one that the Americans have. But I think we are just beginning to break through that barrier.
Anyone else have any comments for the NHS? We're slightly short time, so quick questions, please. There's a gentleman here. Shall we maybe take 2 quick ones and then round up?
Okay, so going through social media, there's so much misinformation. Young people basically can't tolerate other people's ideas, and it's very difficult to have conversations. So, what do you think we can do to counter misinformation and make sure young people are getting the right facts so that we can have informed debates?
Thanks, gentlemen at the back.
Yes, so lots of people in the US have talked about something that's been described as woke capitalism. What I think a lot of the Trumpian sort of discourse that you guys were talking about, I think a lot of people feel that that's been in response to individualism leading to a kind of lack of a moral core and a moral focus. And I think I agree with you, Mr. Hannan, about the dangers of collectivism, but I think a lot of the identity politics and things we've seen is almost sort of Hobbesian individualism and competing wills, but acting on a group level. Would you say that individualism kind of lends itself to having that moral core of virtue and duty that can hold society together?
So we've got disinformation and the moral value of individualism.
I can go on. So to go on both of those quickly, I mean, I think misinformation is a very important issue, but I'm not quite sure about sort of the idea of, like, you know, the BBC verified, the BBC setting up a room full of people to tell you what the BBC's version of the truth. I mean, one of our statistics was covered recently, and they listed us as the Centre for Policy Studies, which I think which identifies itself as a centre-right think tank. And I was like, yes, the CPS has embraced self-ID. We self-identify as a centre-right think tank. I wasn't quite sure what the point of that was. On the other question, so what the other question was? Individualism. So I mean, one of my favourite statistics is, obviously, ESG investing has sort of grown up as this idea to bring virtue to capital. I mean, our old chairman, Maurice Sartre, always used to say, if you're putting a word in front of capitalism, you're apologising for it. So, you know, any other form of, you know, I mean, healthy capitalism or, but ESG was. It was this sort of nice capitalism, we'll only invest in good things. There was some rather nice research which showed that all these nasty US companies which don't have any of these ESG monitoring requirements are actually doing just as much nice stuff in their communities. They're donating just as much charity. They're actually doing sort of more good things in the world beyond just making a profit and employing people than all the European companies which have formally signed up to all the ESG declarations. So I don't think there's a natural tension between capitalism and morality.
There are 3 principles that were part of conservatism in the 1980s when I was your age, and we seem to have lost them, or we prioritize one and not the other 2. Freedom, community, and responsibility, individual responsibility, and all 3 of them have a role to play. If you promote all 3 of them, you can't have a bad conversation. You can't tear each other apart. People get looked after. With community, guarantees that those who are under the most stress and strain are helped. With personal responsibility, it limits our freedom because you can't drive through a red light just because you want to. Or you can't walk up to someone and tell them they're an idiot just because you disagree with them. And with the freedom, it means that you actually get to achieve, you get to pursue your dreams. And unencumbered by some government who tells you what to do or what not to do. It's driving me crazy that right now Labour seems to be supporting this 20-mile-an-hour limit. They seem to be telling you what you can or can't drive, where you can or can't live, what you can or can't say, what you can or can't do. It's so ripe for a challenge, but it also requires the conservatives to have an answer for those who've been left behind and for those who've been forgotten. So those are the three principles that I wish were back into conservatism right now.
And I think there's clearly not a contradiction between individualism and virtue. On the contrary, I would say that it's only actually when you have individual freedom of choice and personal responsibility, the crucial extra element that Frank mentioned, that you can have true virtue. What is virtue? It's about doing what you're told. Or doing something only because you are either afraid of sanctions or because you've been ordered to do it. There's like very minimal quality of virtue in that. So I actually think there is a close association between the two. And the key thing is to realize that individualism and individual liberty does not mean the ability to do whatever you want. It means the ability to do what you want, but with regard to the duties and obligations that you have to the people around you, the people in your family, the people in your locality, the rest of your fellow citizens in the country. It's not a kind of pure license to do what you will. As to the whole question of media and so on, I think that this is a big challenge because the way that our media has developed over the last 20 years has undermined notions of any kind of shared or common truth. There's this kind of notion doing the rounds at the moment, well, I have my truth and you have your truth, which is like preposterous. But of course the reality is that people do not live that way. If you try to live that way, you kill yourself pretty much. You know, if you try to think, well, my truth says there isn't a car coming towards me in the street right now, you wouldn't be long for this world. But what we need to do is two things. I think one is what Dan mentioned, which is education. Educating people simply in things like how to rate different kinds of fact claims. Critical thinking is enormously important. It's something I think that should be a key part of the, certainly the secondary school curriculum, maybe even the primary school curriculum, to teach people from a very early age how to weigh up different truth claims and decide which one they're going to assign not certainty to, but the greater degree of probable rightness to, because that's the way to do it. But the other thing we have to do, all of us, by working together, is to create institutions that will perform the kind of roles that Robert was talking about fact-checking, for example, or providing guidance on claims made by people, because right now at the moment we don't have that, I think, and that's a big lack.
Well, actually, say what you will about Elon Musk, the community notes feature on Twitter is actually really good.
Very good, yes.
So Steve, of course, is quite right about how you can't coerce virtue, nor can you contract it out. And I think this is really important when we talk about ESG, right? A company that makes a profit and employs people doesn't have to then make up for bad behavior. That is a moral thing to do. As Wesley put it, get all you can, save all you can, give all you can. It seems to me the moral thing to do, if you run a company, is to maximize your profits and then out of your own profits, give as widely as you can to whatever good causes you can afford to. Be as charitable as you can as an individual, but don't farm that out to other people, to your suppliers, your customers, your shareholders, and then go around feeling virtuous about it. Make it your own money, right? That seems to me a fundamental point. And I build on that a general point that the most virtuous societies are the ones where we allow people consciously to choose to do the right thing. Again, this is why we should be teaching more Milton in schools. All of the places that begin by saying, why don't we collectively do this and show how nice we are, end up leaving less room for personal responsibility, for personal virtue. And when taken to its extreme, I mean, obviously you don't, there are gradations and they're not all totalitarian, but when you take to its extreme the idea that there is a kind of collective repository of virtue in the state, you end up with the kind of communist regimes we had where all civil society is destroyed. When János Kádár took over in Hungary, his job was to take, before he became General Secretary, his first job after the coup was to destroy every civil association, the tennis club, the Boy Scouts, the village band, everything, and replace them with a party vehicle, right? It seems to me there is no surer way to destroy the actual ties that we have one to another than with this attempt to nationalize virtue. If I may, just on the first question on the conspiracy theories, I really do worry about this. What Steve just said about alternative truths is, I mean, let me run past you 4 unusual takes on how the world supposedly works. And let me present the idea that if you find somebody who believes two of these, they will almost certainly go for all four. Number one, vaccines do more harm than good and are only distributed because the health authorities are in the hands of in the pockets of big pharma. Number two, the Ukraine war was started by NATO. Number three, the world is controlled or at least heavily influenced by this shadowy cabal of people who meet in Davos every year. Number four, governments are trying to phase out cash so that they can control us through digital currencies. They almost always come as a package, don't they? You will all know people who believe in some of them, and almost always it's a clean sweep, right? Because very few people believe only one conspiracy theory, because it's a state of mind. It's not a product of analysis and deduction. Here's what worries me is how much media there now is behind all of these, often sold as a package, newspapers, talk shows, let alone the internet. What can we do? Well, one thing we can do is to be super careful that governments themselves don't engage in sort of platonic noble lie disinformation. I think a big part of why the vaccine skepticism got going is because during the pandemic, governments around the democratic world did engage in two bits of disinformation. First, a fairly minor one over the efficacy of face masks, but then a much more serious one over whether vaccines were an effective way of halting transmission rather than just keeping you out of hospital, right? We know that vaccines are pretty good, especially at keeping vulnerable people from falling seriously ill, but we were told young people have to get them as well because otherwise we won't be able to slow transmission. And we now know that they knew at the time, the WHO, Pfizer, they've all said, no, that was never true. It was never an effective... Now, I'm afraid when... I can think of people who went from asking a perfectly reasonable question, which is, why were the mandates forcing young people to get inoculated against a disease that was no threat to them? They've gone from that into, oh, maybe all vaccines are bad for you. Oh, and why are we believing what we're told about Ukraine, right? So the only practical, concrete thing that I think we all need to be aware of, especially those of us in or around politics, is governments cannot afford to tell what they think of as, you know, effective short-term white lies, because the long-term impact of the loss of confidence can be catastrophic.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I think we have to wrap up there, but thank you so much to all my panel. It's been a really fascinating conversation. If you would like to know more about the work of the CPS, come and find me or one of the team, and please do subscribe to CapX. We never apologise for capitalism, we never put words in front of it, we just put an X after it. So please do sign up, and please do come to the rest of our amazing events here in the CPS space, and have a great conference.
And if you're under age 25, if you can come up here and spend 5 minutes with me, I want to understand why you're here. Only those who are under age 25